Donald Trump says he wants every car sold in the US to be made in the US, and he's willing to disrupt an entire industry.
If I told you that a single political decision could disrupt more than 5 million American jobs, erase tens of billions of United States vehicle exports, and push the entire North American supply chain toward the edge of collapse, would you believe it? That is exactly the scenario now emerging as the United States and Canada accelerate toward a full-scale trade confrontation centered on one industry, automobiles. At the core of this conflict is a simple but dangerous question. Can the United States fix its long-standing automotive trade deficit without destabilizing the very market that buys most of its vehicles? And how far is Canada willing to go in a retaliatory strategy that could reshape the profit margins of every major American automaker? Stay with this report until the end, because the deeper we go, the more a shocking truth becomes clear. This trade war may hit the United States harder than anyone expects, and the final numbers will surprise you. To understand why the current trade war between the United States and Canada is intensifying, we need to begin with the structural pressures shaping decision-making in Washington. The automotive trade gap has expanded for more than 20 years, and it now represents one of the largest deficits in the entire United States economy. According to the United States Census Bureau, the country imported nearly $388 billion in vehicles and auto parts during the year 2023, while exporting only $74 billion. This is not a routine imbalance. It is a long-term structural fracture. These numbers are fueling political momentum. Many lawmakers in the United States now point to this gap as evidence that the North American supply chain is disproportionately benefiting Canadian and Mexican producers at the expense of American workers. That is why former President Donald Trump's proposal for a 25% tariff on all vehicles and components imported from Canada has reemerged as a central point of debate. The goal is straightforward: reduce imports, pull manufacturing capacity back into the United States, and shrink the deficit immediately. But once we look past the surface, the strategy exposes a dangerous contradiction. Canada is not a distant competitor. Canada is the primary structural pillar of the United States automotive system. According to Statistics Canada, Canadian auto exports reached approximately $62 billion in the year 2024, and more than 86 of that total flowed directly into the United States market. The border does not simply move goods, it moves labor value, engineering, electronics, aluminum frames, transmissions, and profit margins. Research by the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development shows that a vehicle assembled in Michigan can contain anywhere from 25 to 35 Canadian-sourced components. In other words, when Washington imposes new tariffs on Canada, it is not only striking a partner, it is striking its own production ecosystem. This is why analysts warn that even short disruptions in cross-border flows could trigger immediate shutdowns at factories in Michigan, Ohio, and Illinois. Just-in-time supply chains give manufacturers very little room to absorb even minor breaks. Yet, this is only the beginning of the story. The deeper challenge lies in a vulnerability the United States has not fully addressed, one that Canada is uniquely positioned to exploit, and one that could reshape the balance of power in this trade confrontation. The next section reveals the single largest weakness that makes the United States auto industry extremely vulnerable to Canadian retaliation. The United States approach assumes that higher tariffs placed on Canadian vehicles will reduce foreign competition, bring manufacturing back onto American soil, and narrow the long-standing deficit in the automotive sector. At first glance, the logic appears simple. Canada sends roughly $62 billion in vehicle exports across the border each year. If tariffs push production away from Ontario and into states such as Michigan, Tennessee, and Kentucky, the United States could immediately reduce its dependence on imports. However, the automotive system does not operate like a simple on-off switch. It is a web of cross-border integration that has been built since the Auto Pact of the year 1965. A modern vehicle assembled in the United States contains components that may cross the border 5, 10, or even 15 times before final assembly. Engines built in Ontario power United States vehicles. Steel frames from the Midwest are shaped in Canadian facilities. Electronics produced in Quebec end up in dashboards assembled in Ohio. When tariffs disrupt this movement, they do not merely shift production, they multiply costs. The Center for Automotive Research estimates that even a modest tariff increase would raise the cost of building a typical vehicle in the United States by more than $1,700. Higher production costs become higher sticker prices, and that weakens demand across the entire United States market. Politically, this creates a second contradiction. The United States cannot afford declining demand at a moment when American consumers are already struggling with elevated financing rates for vehicle loans and rising insurance costs. If tariffs increase prices just as credit conditions tighten, the outcome is predictable: slower sales, reduced manufacturing output, and job losses in the same states tariffs were meant to protect. This is the point many United States policymakers have not fully absorbed. A trade war with Canada does not create a clean victory. It creates a ripple effect that hits American workers, American factories, and American households long before it weakens Canada. And yet, this is only half of the equation. The other half is where the real vulnerability of the United States emerges and where Canada's hidden leverage becomes extraordinarily powerful. While the United States focuses on its deficit, Canada holds a form of leverage that is rarely discussed in Washington, but widely understood by automotive economists: consumer purchasing power. In the year 2024, Canada imported nearly $92 billion in vehicles, and more than $55 billion of that total came directly from the United States. Put simply, Canada is the single most important foreign customer for the United States auto industry. The United States cannot replace this market. European nations prefer domestic brands. Japan and South Korea have deeply established automakers of their own. China's rapidly expanding electric vehicle sector is already overwhelming several global markets and has no incentive to buy American models. This leaves Canada and Mexico as the only scalable, high-value export destinations for United States vehicles. This is precisely why a Canadian shift in purchasing behavior would carry enormous consequences. If Canadian consumers reduce their purchases of United States vehicles by even 20%, the United States would lose approximately $11 billion in export revenue. A reduction of 40% would erase more than $22 billion, equivalent to shutting down multiple assembly plants for an entire year. Canada has alternatives. Japanese and South Korean manufacturers already hold a substantial share of the Canadian market. Mexico remains a competitive source of affordable vehicles. Germany and several European nations are increasing electric vehicle exports annually. And many United States brands produce models in Canada itself, especially in Ontario, meaning Canadians could continue buying the same brands without supporting United States production lines. This combination, declining United States competitiveness, high dependence on Canadian consumers, and abundant alternatives for Canada, creates a structural vulnerability Washington cannot easily defend against. And what comes next, if Canada chooses to use this leverage, could transform a political dispute into a multi-billion-dollar shockwave for the entire United States auto sector. The next section reveals how quickly that shockwave could hit and why the timing of United States tariffs may be far more dangerous than policymakers realize. From Washington's perspective, the new automotive tariffs appear to deliver a straightforward political benefit. They allow leaders to claim they are finally confronting foreign competition. They create the image of a United States government defending domestic manufacturing. And they echo a familiar promise: reshoring jobs, rebuilding plants, and restoring industrial dominance. But when examined through the lens of economics rather than politics, the situation becomes far more complex. The United States cannot isolate itself from Canada without triggering self-inflicted damage. Over the past 3 decades, the United States automotive system has evolved into a continental network rather than a national one. The United States relies on Canadian aluminum, electronics, engines, battery modules, and advanced components that are not easily replaced or replicated domestically. This raises a critical point. Every new tariff imposed on Canada increases production costs inside the United States itself. Research from the United States International Trade Commission shows that the previous cycle of tariffs on steel and aluminum raised United States vehicle prices between $800 and $1,400 per unit. That price shock occurred even though the tariffs were imposed on only a portion of the supply chain. A full automotive tariff targeting Canada would be vastly larger in scale. It would impact assembly plants, component factories, and distribution networks simultaneously. And it would hit at a moment when American consumers are already facing elevated interest rates on car loans, higher insurance premiums, and rising maintenance costs. This creates a political paradox. The same regions expected to benefit from the tariffs, Midwestern manufacturing states would likely feel the earliest and most severe consequences. Temporary shutdowns in Michigan or Ohio would ripple into part suppliers, small businesses, and freight operators. The result could be job losses in precisely the areas the policy was designed to protect. Yet the greatest challenge for Washington is not domestic. It is international. Other nations are watching how the United States treats its closest ally, and their reactions will shape the next decade of global automotive competition. And that brings us to the second dimension of this conflict, the widening global implications that could shift market power away from the United States faster than many policymakers expect. A trade war of this scale does not occur in isolation. It sends signals, and those signals are being read very carefully across Asia and Europe. In the global automotive industry, every shift in market access creates opportunity for someone else. And right now, the United States is opening the door for its competitors. Japan and South Korea, with long-established reputations for reliability and efficiency, already hold substantial market share in Canada. If United States vehicles become more expensive due to tariffs, Japanese and Korean automakers can immediately expand their footprint without altering a single production line. Their supply chains are stable, their export capacity is strong, and their pricing remains competitive. Germany, meanwhile, views the United States-Canada dispute as an opening to accelerate electric vehicle expansion into North America. German automakers are investing heavily in battery technologies and premium electric models. A weakening of United States automotive exports to Canada would give European brands more runway to scale. But the most significant global player is China. China exported more than 5 million vehicles in the year 2023, making it the largest vehicle exporter in the world. Chinese electric vehicle manufacturers are aggressively targeting international markets where political resistance is lower. Canada, unlike the United States or the European Union, has not yet imposed broad-scale restrictions on Chinese electric vehicles. If Chinese automakers gain ground in Canada during this trade war, the consequences for the United States could be long-lasting. Every unit China sells in Canada is one less potential sale for an American manufacturer. And if Canadian consumers become accustomed to Chinese-built electric vehicles, the United States risks losing long-term brand loyalty across an entire generation of buyers. In essence, the conflict between the United States and Canada is not only a bilateral dispute. It is an opening for global rivals to capture market share, reshape consumer preferences, and undermine the influence of United States automakers far beyond North America. And the next development will determine whether this remains a political disagreement or escalates into a full-scale economic fracture, one that could permanently alter the North American automotive landscape. When policymakers in Washington authorize new tariffs against Canada, the immediate expectation is that Canadian exporters will absorb most of the damage. But the structure of the North American automotive system proves otherwise. The first wave of economic shock will be felt inside the United States itself, and it will strike faster than many expect. The automotive industry supports more than 5 million American jobs. This network includes assembly workers in Michigan and Ohio, parts manufacturers in Tennessee and Indiana, electronics suppliers in California, and thousands of small machine shops across the Midwest. Every one of these operations relies on predictable, uninterrupted cross-border supply lines with Canada. Just-in-time manufacturing leaves factories with only a narrow window of component inventory. In some assembly plants, a disruption of only 60 minutes is enough to halt production. If tariffs create even a minor delay in shipments coming from Ontario or Quebec, lines in Detroit, Toledo, and Lansing could shut down within hours. And each shutdown triggers ripple effects, lost wages, reduced overtime, canceled shifts, and supply bottlenecks that compound rapidly. Consumer costs are another critical vulnerability for the United States. Vehicle prices have risen sharply over the past several years due to higher loan interest rates, higher insurance premiums, and increased production costs. When the previous round of tariffs affected steel and aluminum imports, American buyers saw vehicle prices rise between $800 and $1,400 per unit. A broad automotive tariff targeting Canada could create an even more aggressive price jump, pushing new models further out of reach for middle-income families. Higher prices mean slower sales mean reduced factory output, and reduced output means job losses across the American heartland. Analysts at the Center for Automotive Research estimate that a sustained decline in Canadian demand for United States vehicles could eliminate between 90,000 and 120,000 American jobs. That number does not include secondary industries such as logistics, warehousing, or freight transport, which would also face substantial losses. The economic threat is not hypothetical, it is structural. And if Washington underestimates its severity, the consequences could reshape employment patterns across multiple states. But while the United States faces exposure, Canada is confronting a different set of risks that are equally substantial, yet far more strategic in how they might transform the country's industrial future. Canada's automotive economy is both vulnerable and resilient. Vulnerable because nearly all of its vehicle exports flow into a single market, the United States. Resilient because Canada has a diversified set of manufacturing capabilities and a consumer market with the power to redirect demand when necessary. If the United States expands its tariffs, Canada will face immediate pressure on assembly lines in Ontario, where most of the country's automotive production takes place. These plants employ thousands of high-skilled workers and support entire regional economies. A steep decline in exports could temporarily suppress output, reduce shifts, and threaten the stability of surrounding communities that rely on automotive employment. However, Canada's domestic market presents an unusual advantage. Canadians buy a significant number of vehicles each year, and their purchasing decisions have the power to shift production patterns. If Canadian consumers consciously prioritize vehicles built in Canada, such as models produced by Honda, Toyota, Ford, and General Motors within Ontario, local factories could see increased orders even if exports decline. This possibility grows stronger when combined with the presence of Japanese, Korean, German, and Mexican models in the Canadian market. These brands offer Canada alternatives that do not rely on United States production capacity. A coordinated consumer pivot away from United States-built vehicles could fundamentally rewire Canada's automotive landscape and reduce its dependence on American imports permanently. From a social perspective, such a shift would strengthen domestic employment, stabilize manufacturing communities, and increase political support for Canadian-made products. It would also reinforce a sense of national economic independence at a moment when the trade war with the United States is raising concerns about long-term security. But the most important dynamic is this. If Canada chooses to exercise its consumer leverage, it could transform the balance of power in the North American automotive sector faster than tariffs alone ever could. And now we approach the turning point. The next phase of this trade war is not just about economics. It is about strategy, timing, and the possibility of an irreversible shift in the continental automotive order. The long-term consequences of the trade war between the United States and Canada extend far beyond temporary shutdowns or seasonal fluctuations in exports. What is unfolding now carries the potential to redraw the industrial map of North America for an entire generation. If the United States continues to escalate tariffs on Canadian automotive products, several structural risks begin to move into focus. First, the integrated supply chain that has defined North American manufacturing for more than 60 years could fragment permanently. Companies do not tolerate unpredictable borders. If automakers conclude that cross-border flows can be interrupted by politics at any time, they will relocate production to wherever the risk is lowest. In many cases, that does not mean the United States. It means Mexico, where labor costs are lower, regulations are more stable, and exports flow freely into both the United States and Canada. Second, the trade war could accelerate the entry of non-North American automakers into the region. Chinese electric vehicle manufacturers, German premium brands, and Japanese and Korean mass-market producers all stand ready to expand. If Canadian consumers turn away from United States-built vehicles, international brands will fill the vacuum. And once consumer habits shift, they rarely shift back. Third, long-term investment decisions may move offshore. Battery plants, electric vehicle assembly facilities, research centers, and advanced manufacturing hubs require predictability. If investors see unpredictability in United States-Canada relations, they may choose to place these factories elsewhere. That would weaken the United States' position not only against Canada, but against Europe and Asia. But the most significant long-term risk is political. A prolonged confrontation could erode public trust in the United States-Canada partnership, one of the most stable economic relationships in modern history. If that foundation cracks, cooperation on energy, defense, and technology could also weaken. Yet even with these risks, Canada faces a different long-term landscape, one that holds the possibility of transformation rather than decline. Canada's position in this trade war is not defined solely by vulnerability. It is defined by choice, and that choice opens several long-term opportunities. If tariffs from the United States continue, Canada has the option to redirect investment into electric vehicle production, battery technology, and domestic supply chain development. Multiple automakers already operate major factories in Ontario. With sufficient demand and political support, these factories could expand output, add new shifts, or attract additional models for local production. The second opportunity lies in reshaping consumer behavior. If Canadians begin prioritizing vehicles manufactured in Canada or sourced from international partners, domestic factories gain stability and leverage. That stability encourages automakers to commit more capital to Canadian plants, creating long-term employment and reducing reliance on United States imports. The third strategic opportunity arises from global competition. As China, Germany, Japan, and South Korea intensify their presence in global automotive markets, Canada could negotiate favorable supply agreements, attract new manufacturing investments, or integrate itself into global electric vehicle supply chains in ways that are not dependent on the United States at all. And there is a fourth opportunity, one that may become the most important over time. If Canadian consumers successfully shift away from United States vehicles, Canadian policymakers gain negotiating power. In the next USMCA review cycle, scheduled for the year 2026, Canada could enter the table not as a vulnerable partner, but as a country with demonstrated market leverage and the ability to influence outcomes. These long-term paths reveal a truth few expected at the beginning of this trade war. The side applying tariffs may not be the side with the strongest strategic position. And the next part reveals the most critical question of all, one that could define the entire trajectory of the North American automotive future. The trade war now unfolding between the United States and Canada is no longer a temporary dispute, nor a simple disagreement over tariffs. It has evolved into a direct test of the continent's economic architecture. What began as a political attempt to reduce the United States automotive deficit has exposed a deeper reality. The stability of the North American auto industry depends on cooperation, not confrontation. If the United States continues down its current path, it risks weakening its own factories, destabilizing its own workforce, and pushing consumers in Canada toward global competitors who are fully prepared to expand their reach. If Canada chooses to exercise its leverage, the United States could face a decline in export revenue, a loss of market share, and a wave of industrial uncertainty that even higher tariffs cannot reverse. The next phase of this confrontation will determine far more than monthly trade balances. It will shape manufacturing decisions, cross-border politics, and the competitive position of North America in a rapidly shifting global market. So the defining question becomes clear. Is this a bold strategy destined to strengthen the United States, or a historic miscalculation that could empower Canada and permanently reshape the continental automotive landscape?